In January of 1993, the World Wrestling Federation kicked off what currently stands as the longest reigning weekly episodic program in television history when they launched Monday Night Raw on the USA Network. Despite running a variety of syndicated programs in previous years and their one-off primetime shows like Saturday Night's Main Event, this was the WWF's first foray into a weekday primetime program. The show would serve as a platform for some of the highest-rated television programming in the late 1990s, but they'd still be finding their way in late 1994. Around the same time, the WWF Raw would make its way onto a variety of video game consoles, including the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Game Boy, Game Gear, and the Sega 32X. The game marked the third of a trilogy of games on the Super NES and Sega Genesis, following Royal Rumble and Super WrestleMania before it. At first glance, aside from a couple of cosmetic and aesthetic differences, it looks like the same game, but there are a few changes worth mentioning. First off, the roster, as always, has seen some changes from previous games, including, for the first time, the ability to wrestle as a woman. The inclusion of Luna in WWF Raw definitely strayed from the norm, but her in-game character is more than just a palette swap, as most wrestlers in the game were all attributed with the same grunts and groans. Luna, being a woman, incorporated a different tone, as she should have, though it does sound kind of funny. Other notable roster additions on the Super Nintendo and Genesis included the King of Hearts, Owen Hart, Big Daddy Cool, Diesel, the 1-2-3 Kid, and Doink the Clown. This was as the WWF was really digging into their new generation era of wrestling. Pro wrestling has always been a haven for wacky characters, but mid-90s WWF was on another level. You had plumbers and hockey players, garbage men, priests, and even a f***ing Mantar. Despite that, the organization still boasted world champion performers, which is why I was excited as a young Canadian wrestling fan to see both Bret and Owen Hart in the game. I grew up just 90 minutes away from where the Hart family was so famous, and they were both so big around these parts that it almost became a foregone conclusion that when I fired up Raw on the Super Nintendo, my gameplay always featured a member of the Harts first and foremost. Again, roster aside, the game does appear similar to the ones that came before it. Sure, the presentation is a little different, but the little tweaks are enjoyable. Seeing the character selection screen on a monitor in a production suite, or the multiple screen logo display following the match, those little changes are a nice touch. There's also the addition of two separate commentary teams, featuring the longtime Raw broadcast duo of Jerry the King Lawler and Vince McMahon at ringside. There's also the team of WWE Hall of Famer Gorilla Monsoon and Stephanie Wyand.
Stephanie Wyand made her World Wrestling Federation debut on Christmas Eve 1994 when she debuted on the Saturday morning show WWF Mania. Wyand was brought in as a co-host on the show alongside Todd Pettengill, but had the tall task of replacing Macho Man Randy Savage, who had left the company. Her tenure in the organization didn't last long, as she stuck around for just a few months before leaving the WWF in the summer of 1995. Today, she continues work on screen and behind the camera as an actress and producer.
As far as the gameplay goes, just a couple of tweaks here to match types. Sadly, the cage match from Rage in the Cage is gone, but in its place are a Bedlam match and a Raw Endurance match. The Bedlam match is what is traditionally referred to as a Texas Tornado match, which is a tag team bout where all four wrestlers are in the ring at the same time. The Bedlam match is slightly different though, where you need to defeat both opponents to win the bout. In a Raw Endurance match, it's a bit of a wild setup, where you have the option of choosing between 1 to 6 wrestlers to face off against 6 opponents. It's an elimination style match, so the first team to defeat all of their opponents wins. 6-on-6, 3-on-6, or a complete 1-on-6 handicap match all depends on how froggy you're feeling. Now, one of the biggest and most welcome additions is the inclusion of some new moves for some of the wrestlers. While most of the moves in the game are similar to times of yore, there are a few additions like the side slam, DDT, faceplant, and a handful of others. Another major addition is the use of mega moves, which are not the easiest things to pull off in a game. They're neat to see, and you'll likely see the AI pull them off randomly in a match, then pull them off for yourself. For example, to pull off Luna's, you need to hold both the L and R shoulder buttons and then press left, down, and down B, and doing that above a downed opponent. It can be done, but with the action fairly fast-paced, don't get your hopes up of pulling them off very often. And I don't often mention cheats, but there is a fairly pronounced one on the 32X. By pressing down A and B at the wrestler's select screen, you can unlock the superstar Quang. We won't go into another Wrestling 101 segment here, but of all the wrestlers to unlock, Quang? Now, WWF Raw was also ported onto the 8-bit handhelds of the time, including both the Game Boy and the Game Gear. But oh boy, let's not spend too much time here. For obvious reasons, there's some downscaling from their 16 and 32-bit counterparts, but these are something else altogether. It's not fair to bag on them for their graphical faults, but it's the gameplay that kills it. Like most wrestling games on handhelds of the time, it's clunky and slow, which is fine, I guess, but it's just boring. The grappling seems insanely difficult and inconsistent, and the damage inflicted from moves is so insignificant that it takes forever to get your opponent's energy bar low enough to even pin them to try and win. And heaven help you if you're in a tag team match. These ports are atrocious. I will say though, the Game Gear port looks sharp, and you can't take that away from it. It's like a beautifully polished turd. WWF Raw reviewed well in its day, and while the 32X took a few hits from reviewers for not adding much more with the extra 16 bits, it's still a worthwhile experience despite being more of the same. Raw would be the last of the LJN trilogy of 16-bit WWF games, and after 3 titles that felt fairly similar, fans were ready for a new wrestling experience, and in 1995, they would get just that, and then some.